Most individuals observing the headlines thought this was a story about Venezuela, approximately Donald Trump, or about another chapter in the unending culture war that presently outlines each outside policy decision. But that misses the real narrative. What unfurled here was a revealing minute, approximately political leadership. Before going to break down this news, please subscribe USA Close-Up. Consolidation, administration, and moral clarity, one that told us distant more about Canada's overseeing course than about Caracas or Washington. Here's the surface story you as of now know. The United States conducted an operation resulting in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, a figure broadly respected across democratic governments as an illegitimate ruler who directed over systematic restraint, constituent fraud, corruption, and the collapse of a once functional state. In no time afterward, Canada's Prime Serve issued a statement. That explanation condemned Maduro's record, confirmed bolster for democracy, lauded universal law, and talked enigmatically around multilateral engagement and serene moves. It did not say the joined together states. It did not say the operation. It expressed not one nor the other endorsement nor disapproval of how Maduro was removed. It was in frame and substance an exercise in examined equivocation. Read quickly, you might discover it unobjectionable. After all, who opposes democracy, human rights, or peaceful outcomes? But legislative issues is not a graduate seminar in theoretical values. It is the art of choosing. What mattered here was not what the explanation said, but what it conspicuously dodged saying. In moments like this, lack of bias is not impartial. It is a choice to sidestep responsibility. To get at why this things, consider the motivating forces forming Canadian politics right presently. The administering consolidation is not a bound-together philosophical extent. It is a sewed-together course of arrangement of voters with strongly diverse instincts about control, markets, and America. Some view Donald Trump as an existential threat whose each activity must be reflexively condemned. Others, especially those tied to exchange, finance, and vitality, may disdain his fashion but care profoundly around results and stability. Administration in such a coalition requires either influence or prioritization. What it cannot survive on uncertainly is avoidance. The Prime Minister chose avoidance. Instead of acknowledging that something decisive had happened, instead of clarifying how Canada gets the adjust between sovereignty and responsibility, instead of telling citizens why this minute fits or does not fit our standards, he produced dialect that may have been released nearly any year beneath almost any circumstances. It was timeless in the most noticeably awful way, detached from events as they actually unfolded. You might reject this as mere communication technique, but this is where etiquette unobtrusively weaken. Democracies depend on pioneers who can explain why certain activities, however uncomfortable, are justified and why others are not. When governments retreat into bland definitions to avoid offending groups inside their own base, they prepare citizens to expect nothing more than ethical backdrop. Over time, voters halt tuning in, not because they are critical, but since they are being given nothing to lock in with. What made this scene particularly telling was the differentiate. Resistance pioneers were willing to take a position knowing full well it would outrage some voters. That's not recklessness, that's accountability. It allows citizens to agree or disapprove this idea, to compensate or punish. A statement that annoys no one also instructs no one. This is not about applauding any outside pioneer as a hero, nor almost underwriting each device of American control. It is almost whether elected authorities can still speak plainly when reality intrudes on theory. Dictators once in a while take off office since of carefully worded communicates. They leave since weight is applied, sometimes defectively, sometimes controversially, but unequivocally. As a viewer, you ought to care about this because the propensity of non-commitment does not remain limited to foreign policy. It relocates. It appears up in trade debates, in national security, in economic stuns. A government that cannot tell you what it considers when the stakes are self-evident will battle to tell you the truth when the stakes are murkier. And that's the more profound story hiding underneath a statement that tried very hard to say nothing at all. There is also a more profound misconception at work here around how legitimacy functions in the cutting-edge global framework. We often talk as in spite of though legitimacy is a matter of tone, process, and properly footnoted resolutions, when in reality it rests on a combination of assent and enforcement. Maduro mislost assent years ago. Decisions that are not one nor the other free nor fair do not bestow authority, no matter how many times they are organized. At that point, legitimacy becomes a question of whether the international community is willing to treat the reality as genuine. When leaders imagine that a negotiated transition is continuously available, even after every road has been closed by the administration itself, they are not being principled. They are being sly. You could hear this avoidance in the phrasing about serene forms and multilateral engagement.
Those words sound sympathetic, and frequently they are, but they can moreover gotten to be an asylum from judgment. Quiet results are desirable. Arranged arrangements are preferable. The address is what you do when the other side employments transactions as a slowing down strategy, when multilateral forums ended up cemeteries for accountability, and when delay itself becomes a frame of complicity. At some point, demanding on strategy over outcome ceases to be ethical restriction and becomes ethical abandonment. This is where leadership is tried, not by whether you can recount the adjust values, but by whether you can clarify trade-offs honestly. You might accept the American operation set a perilous point of reference. If so, say that and protect it. You might believe it was essential intervention against a criminal administration. If so, say that and clarify why it does not license chaos somewhere else. What corrodes belief is the refusal to select either argument combined with the presumption that citizens will botch dubiousness for wisdom. Consolidation legislative issues makes this temptation more grounded, not weaker. When a party is held together by groups that share a poll line but not a worldview, the way of slightest resistance is ambiguity. Over time, be that as it may, ambiguity becomes a propensity, and propensities solidify into character. Voters take note. They may not articulate it in scholastic dialect, but they sense when pioneers are managing optics or maybe than making judgments. That discernment does more harm than any single questionable choice ever could. There is, too, an institutional cost. Canada's outside policy credibility has customarily rested on being unsurprising, not detached. Allies may oppose this idea with us, but they have generally known where we stand. Statements like this dissolve that clarity. When accomplices cannot tell whether silence signals caution, dissatisfaction, or indecision, they mark it down altogether. The nation gets to be show in frame, but absent in impact. You can see how quickly this dynamic spills into domestic disavowal. Instead of arguing about standards, individuals contend about motives. Instead of inquiring whether a dictator's expulsion progresses equity or stability, they contend almost who is afraid of whom inside a party coalition. That is a sign of legislative issues hollowing out. Substance gives way to factional psychology. I need to be clear about something. None of this requires you to admire American presidents or to celebrate the utilize of constraint. Skepticism about constraint is sound. Concern about precedent is authentic. But skepticism only has esteem when combined with alternatives that are grounded in reality. Basically rehashing that we support majority-rule government does not clarify how democracy is to be re-established when it has already been devastated.
As a citizen, you are entitled to more than safe sentences. You are entitled to explanations. You are entitled to leaders who believe you sufficient to tell you why they think one course of activity was right, off base, or appalling but necessary. When they deny to do that, they are not ensuring popular government. They are quietly educating individuals that democracy no longer anticipates them to think seriously almost control, responsibility, or result. This scene also illustrates how political calculations can dominate ethical clarity in the daily operations of government. The Prime Minister's consolidation is not merely a collection of approach positions, it is a set of competing loyalties, ideological commitments, and voter sensitivities. One bunch loathes Trump, seeing him as a destabilizing constraint. Another group tolerates him when comes about aligns with their financial interest. Overseeing this tension is verifiably dubious, but there is a distinction between overseeing a coalition and maintaining a strategic distance altogether. What happened here was the latter. Consider the message sent by omission. In a world where activity speaks louder than words, coming up short to acknowledge the operation sends a subtle but powerful flag that procedural caution and inside amalgamation comfort outweigh the criticality of global justice and majority rule accountability. It communicates to citizens that their leaders are more concerned with not offending groups at domestic than with holding an internationally recognized tyrant to account. That is not leadership. It is a shape of passive governance that rangers dissolving both credibility and open belief. It's worth noting that this is not one of a kind to Canada. Popular governments all over struggle when their pioneers prioritize internal politics over coherent remote policy. But the Canadian setting is illustrative because of its fusion flow and the typical weight that outside policy statements carry. When Trudeau's government or any Canadian government speaks, it is frequently studied as a statement about values, not fair strategy. Citizens, outside accomplices, and even adversaries parse every word for intent, signal, and guideline. That magnifies the results of ambiguity. Now, let's step back and consider the mechanics of what really happened in Venezuela. Maduro's administration had entrenched itself through decades of corruption, control of electoral mechanisms, and the utilize of state power to suppress dissent. Races were consistently defaced by irregularities, with sound global observers declaring them illegitimate. For the United States to carry out an operation that captures him and evacuates him from power without a single American casualty is by any degree uncommon. The operation was surgical, precise, and designed to minimize collateral damage, which further underscores the missed opportunity for affirmation in Ottawa. Instead, the Prime Minister's statement read like a non-generic template designed for any emergency anywhere in the world. Words like multilateral engagement, majority rule move, and respect for sovereign rule the message, while the actual context, an unprecedented removal of a criminal dictator, was effectively disregarded. This is not as well a political misstep. It is a failure to communicate competence and situational awareness. Citizens are left asking, on the off chance that the government cannot clearly interpret such a clear-cut event, how can they be trusted to interpret more complex emergency? This brings us to the broader question of credibility. Credibility in foreign policy is cumulative. Every statement, every decision, every vote contributes to a nation's reputation. When leaders hedge too much, when they refuse to acknowledge victory, or even the significance of decisive action, they erode trust with allies and embolden adversaries. Allies end up being unsure whether Canada will stand with them, and adversaries calculate that the government is more interested in optics than results. That's a dangerous combination in a world where information and disinformation travel faster than any official articulation can correct. At the same time, we need to consider the domestic consequences. Political coalitions are fragile, and leaders who cannot navigate them decisively risk not just short-term feedback, but long-term erosion of their authority. By issuing a statement that seeks to annoy no one, the Prime Minister effectively communicates that governance is about minimizing disagreement rather than promoting principles. This may conciliate the die-hard followers briefly, but it alienates moderates and pragmatic voters who expect clarity, judgment, and moral backbone from their pioneers. Over time, this style of cautious non-commitment can empty out a party's base, leaving it vulnerable to more disciplined opponents who are willing to articulate and defend positions. If you strip away the words and the talking points, the deeper lesson of this scene is structural. It is easier to be cautious than courageous, easier to say nothing than something decisive. And while evasion might appear politically safe in the short term, it gradually teaches both politicians and citizens to accept a lower standard of leadership. When leaders consistently avoid the hard calls, they normalize a political culture in which analysis is deferred, judgment is outsourced, and responsibility is diluted. Consider the feedback loop this creates. Citizens learn to expect only carefully calibrated statements. Media outlets, sensing that leadership will not offer clear guidance, pivot to speculation and commentary. Bureaucrats, observing hesitation at the top, become risk-averse. Over time, the machinery of government becomes more interested in managing perception than managing reality. Decisions that require moral courage, rapid judgment, or principled risk-taking are postponed or avoided. This is not a problem for a single statement, it is a problem for the entire system. Contrast that with moments when leaders do make a choice. Opposition figures, as noted earlier, may face immediate criticism for taking a stand, but they also define the terms of debate. They signal to citizens what values actually mean in practice, not just in theory. They show that the government can be held accountable and that citizens' expectations matter. This is why statements like Ottawa's non-committal communiqué are so corrosive. They reduce politics to aesthetics, turning moral clarity into a cosmetic exercise rather than an operational imperative. It also matters internationally. In global affairs, credibility is not a slogan, it is a pattern of behavior. Allies notice consistency, adversaries notice vacillation. When a government refuses to name the significance of a major event, like the removal of Maduro, it inadvertently signals that Canada's alignment is negotiable, its values optional, its reactions dependent on domestic consensus rather than principle. In geopolitics, that is not cautious, it is weak. The ultimate consequence is cultural as much as political. Citizens internalize the message that moral language can be empty, that leadership can be neutralized by fear of internal dissent, and that complexity excuses avoidance. That lesson is far more dangerous than any single misstatement. It creates a population trained to accept a lower threshold of accountability and a government conditioned to offer it. The erosion is incremental, almost invisible, but cumulative and irreversible if uncorrected. The irony is that leadership often demands discomfort. Speaking plainly, especially when it risks offending factions within your coalition, is rarely popular. Yet, history consistently rewards the leaders who articulate choices clearly, defend them, and face the consequences. Non-committal statements, by contrast, invite misinterpretation, fuel cynicism, and dilute authority. In a moment when Canada could have reaffirmed its values while recognizing a pivotal international event, it chose to step aside. This is not a partisan critique, it is an institutional one. The question is not whether Trudeau or any leader is ideologically correct in every judgment. The question is whether they can navigate reality without defaulting to safe language that conceals rather than clarifies. Leadership is not about avoiding mistakes, it is about guiding citizens through the unavoidable, sometimes morally ambiguous terrain of real-world politics. In the Maduro episode, Ottawa failed that test, not through malice, not even through incompetence, but through a habitual retreat from responsibility. In the end, the lesson extends beyond Venezuela or even foreign policy. It is a caution about political habits, about the slow erosion of clarity and trust, and about the subtle ways in which governments teach citizens what to expect and what not to expect from those they elect. Silence may feel like prudence, neutrality may feel like wisdom, but in politics, evasion is never neutral. It is a choice, one with consequences that accumulate quietly but powerfully, shaping both the present and the future of governance. So what does responsible leadership look like in moments like these? How can a government restore credibility, rebuild public trust, and demonstrate that words, when used well, can match action? The answer is deceptively simple: clarity, courage, and context. Clarity means speaking plainly about events as they actually occur. When a foreign leader is captured, when a regime changes, when history turns on a precise moment of action, leaders owe citizens an honest account. This does not require cheerleading or blind endorsement. It does require naming the event, assessing its significance, and explaining the reasoning behind one's own stance. A statement that is precise but principled strengthens both democracy and international credibility. Citizens do not need spin, they need truth. Courage is about prioritizing principle over comfort. Coalition politics is difficult. Managing factions requires nuance, but nuance is not synonymous with non-commitment. Leaders must be willing to articulate positions that risk internal friction if those positions are consistent with the nation's values and interests. Taking a stand, even imperfectly, signals that leadership is about judgment, not just optics. Courage is contagious. It trains citizens to expect accountability, encourages civil discourse, and fosters a political culture where debate is substantive rather than performative. Context is essential for translating abstract values into practical guidance. Democracy, human rights, and sovereignty are not platitudes, they are operational challenges. When leaders provide context, explaining why an action was taken, what risks it entailed, and how it fits into a broader strategy, they equip citizens to understand the trade-offs inherent in governance. Words transform from moral wallpaper into instruments of comprehension and engagement. Beyond these principles, Canada must recognize the long-term consequences of habitual ambiguity. Each evasive statement chips away at institutional credibility, at public confidence, and at the country's influence on the global stage. Reversing this trend requires deliberate effort.
Briefing citizens honestly, consulting allies openly, and demonstrating through both action and explanation that leadership is not synonymous with risk avoidance. Institutions can also help enforce clarity. Parliamentary oversight, independent analysis, and a free press are not mere formalities. They are mechanisms that hold leaders accountable when convenience tempts evasion. When these systems are engaged fully, leaders are encouraged to provide the transparency and reasoning that citizens deserve. Weak statements are tolerated less and scrutinized more, raising the bar for responsible governance. Finally, citizens themselves play a role. Expecting clarity, insisting on explanation, and rewarding honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, is part of sustaining a healthy democracy. Political courage is meaningless without a public willing to listen, understand, and engage. The lesson of the Maduro episode is not only for politicians, it is a call to the electorate to demand substance over style, judgment over optics. Canada's governing class can still recover from episodes like this, but only if it recognizes that leadership is tested not when events are convenient, but when they are complicated, controversial, and morally urgent. A statement that explains, defends, and contextualizes action builds trust. A statement that hides behind safe language erodes it over time. These choices define a nation's character both at home and abroad. In the end, the true measure of leadership is not in avoiding offense, it is in guiding citizens through the realities of power with honesty, responsibility, and courage. Canada, like all democracies, will face such moments again. The question is whether it will respond with clarity and conviction or continue the quiet abdication that has become too comfortable. History does not reward hesitation. It rewards leaders who speak, who choose, and who take responsibility for the consequences. That is the challenge and the opportunity facing Canadian politics today. The Maduro episode and Ottawa's response leave us with a clear lesson. Leadership is measured not in generic statements, but in the willingness to confront reality, make judgments, and communicate them honestly. In politics, as in life, avoiding decisions does not make problems disappear, it merely postpones the reckoning and erodes trust along the way.
Canada's governing class faces a simple but stark choice. It can continue to prioritize internal comfort over clarity, offering statements that soothe factions but leave citizens uncertain and allies guessing. Or it can embrace the harder path, provide explanation, accept risk, and articulate principles in concrete terms. The first path may feel safe in the short term, but it hollows out authority and credibility over the long term. The second path demands courage, but it is the only one that sustains both democratic engagement and international respect. The broader truth is that clarity, courage, and accountability are contagious. When leaders model them, citizens learn to expect them, bureaucracies internalize them, partners respect them. When leaders avoid them, hesitation becomes habit, and hesitation becomes a defining characteristic of governance itself. The Prime Minister's statement about Maduro may have seemed minor at the time, but it is part of a pattern with consequences far beyond a single foreign policy moment. For Canada and for any democracy, the solution is not to react to every event with zeal or partisanship, but to respond with judgment, to name reality, assess it, and communicate choices transparently, to balance coalition interests without sacrificing principles, to recognize that leadership is about more than managing appearances. It is about guiding a nation through complexity with integrity. If Ottawa or any government can learn this lesson, it can restore the trust that episodic evasions slowly corrode. If it cannot, the cost will be both domestic and international. A citizenry trained to expect moral wallpaper, allies uncertain of commitments, and a political culture that rewards non-commitment over courage. The Maduro episode ends not with a simple critique of a single statement, but with a challenge. It asks whether Canadian leaders, and by extension citizens, are willing to insist on a standard of accountability, clarity, and courage that matches the realities of power. That is the ultimate measure of democratic health, and it is the standard that will determine whether Canada's governance is remembered for its character or its convenience. Leadership is never neutral. Silence is always a choice. The question is whether in the moments that matter, Canada will continue to choose wisely. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. Thanks for watching.